Hey friends, I want to talk with you about coming to church. I issued a little plea and invitation a few weeks ago to invite you to come back to worship, and many of you have acted on that and even said, hey, that was helpful, I kind of needed that spur. And I kind of want to continue that conversation with you in this daily briefing. I want to ask you to think about this question. What level of risk are you willing to accept to prioritize the public worship of the Lord Jesus Christ? What level of risk is reasonable to prioritize gathered worship? Here's what I want you to think about. Every time you come to church, every time you go to your gospel community, you're accepting some level of risk. It's just that you have already made the calculations and so you don't consciously think about it. So for instance, you've acknowledged that there's a risk that on your way there, you could die in a car accident. But because the risk of that is low and you've already thought about it, you don't even think about that when you get in your car to drive to church or to go to gospel community. These are kind of the assessments we make every day to live life. There are risks associated with life, and we just sort of factor them into the decisions we make. Well, what happened back in March was that a brand new risk got introduced into the equation, right? It was the risk of COVID, this brand new virus that had just crossed into the human population, and we didn't know anything about it. And so it was right and wise and good for us to treat it as though the risk was immense, as though it posed an imminent threat to human flourishing. And that's why our society shut down and why we did a lot of the things we did in March, April, and into May. Well, my concern as your pastor is this. Some of us are still living as though the risk factors are the same as they were back in March, and they're just not. And so I want to encourage us to reassess how we're thinking about risk related to COVID in light of what we know about it now that we didn't know about it then. And I want to talk about that a little bit using a brand new CDC study that just was released yesterday. So let's use the flu as a comparison. And again, when I do this, I'm not implying that COVID and the flu are the same. I'm just saying they provide helpful comparisons. So the fatality rate for the flu is about 1 in 1,000. Okay, 1 in 1,000 people who contract the flu are actually going to die of the flu. Now, that's a significant fact, but most of us don't think when we get the flu, oh my gosh, I might die. We think, oh, it's going to be a crummy week, I have the flu. Because we realize the likelihood of death from the flu is pretty low for most of us who are healthy. As I talk to people about COVID, what I'm finding is that it seems like our logic is exactly opposite. What we keep thinking is, I might die, or I might contract the virus and pass it to someone else, and I'll be responsible for their death. It's as though our thinking about COVID is entirely revolving around the risk of death or serious complications. Now, I want to show you some interesting data that I think needs to factor into how we think about that. Okay, so at the beginning of this week, the risk factor for COVID was about 4 in 1,000. In other words, about 4 cases out of 1,000 right now result in fatality or death. But what the CDC released yesterday is a brand new antibody study that showed that actually the prevalence of COVID in the population is about 10 times greater than reported cases. In other words, there are many more people who have gotten sick with COVID than have actually had a positive test or been reported as sick. What that means is this risk factor actually decreases significantly, because there are actually a lot more people who have the virus and a lot fewer people who are actually dying from it. Okay, so it changes the calculus here. Now, it's a new study and there's still more work to be done, and we continue to learn more about this every day and every week. But here's what I'm saying to you. I want to encourage you to weigh the current risk that COVID-19 presents to you and to me according to what we actually know about it now, not according to all the unknowns we had back in March. For some of us who have underlying health conditions, this remains a very serious threat, and so you should treat it as such. And by the way, I know there's a bunch of you in our church and you've reached out to me and said, hey, here's my underlying risks and here's the decisions I'm making. I'm so glad that you're making those decisions. We don't want you to come to church. You stay safe, especially if there are complications that make this especially risky for you. But for most of us who are healthy, we do need to reassess the current risk of COVID in light of what it actually presents. And we probably need to start thinking less about, oh, I might die of it, and more about, hey, I'm going to get sick and I'm going to recover, because that's actually the reality for most of us who might come down with COVID-19. Okay, so I want to encourage you to make sure that you're not thinking about and avoiding worship because you're still thinking about things like you did back in March, but that you're actually embracing, okay, the more we know about this virus, the more we understand about the risks, it actually changes how we should weigh those risks in the life that we live. I'm just concerned that there's some of us who are still sort of weighing the risk quite highly, when in reality we might need to be thinking differently about that. Now, each of you has to make that calculation for yourself, and that's the beauty of Christian freedom, is that you're free to act according to your conscience. But it's my job as your pastor to try to, number one, make sure you're working with good current data, and number two, to encourage you to prioritize the public worship of Jesus Christ. And that's really what this is about. I've been laughing a little bit this week because I know a lot of you guys are playing youth sports. I know a lot of you are going back to restaurants. A lot of you are like participating back in life. And I want to say, hey, and we should be participating back in worship also, right? If you're willing to take the risk of going to the grocery store and going to youth sporting events and those kinds of things, we also need to say, hey, we need to prioritize the worship of the Lord Jesus because that matters for God's people. It's a significant place where we meet with God and where our souls are strengthened and encouraged. So I hope that you'll rethink maybe how you've been thinking about risk. I hope that as you're comfortable, you'll make your way back to gathering on Sundays. It really has been life-giving for me over the past 6 to 8 weeks to do that with you. And I'm looking forward to it again this Sunday as we continue our series in the Psalms and as my friend Mike leads us into Psalm 21. So I hope to see you then. And I hope this is helpful to you as you think about your pursuit of public worship.